The Ardennes Forest, late December 1944. A biting, crystalline fog clings to frozen pines, muffling the sound of German boots crunching to the crust of deep snow. For the soldiers of the Volksgrenadier divisions, the morning feels deceptively still. They have been told the Americans are in retreat, their supply lines broken, and their morale shattered by the sudden winter offensive. There is no whistling in the air, no screaming sirens of the Nebelwerfer rockets, or the distant, rhythmic thud of a traditional creeping barrage to warn them of incoming fire. In a single, terrifying heartbeat, the laws of nature seem to invert. The sky does not crack. It shatters. Hundreds of high-explosive shells, launched from batteries miles apart and fired at different intervals, arrive at one singular coordinate at the exact same millisecond. There is no take cover order, no time to dive into a foxhole. One moment, there is a forest. The next, there is only a vertical wall of fire and steel splinters. The earth heaves upward in a singular, monstrous convulsion, and as the smoke clears, nothing remains but the blackened skeletons of trees and the silence of the dead. This was not a bombardment. This was the math of death, perfected. To understand why the German army, a force that had pioneered the Blitzkrieg, was so utterly paralyzed by American artillery, we must first look back at the bloody mud of the Great War. Between 1914 and 1918, artillery was the undisputed king of battle, responsible for the vast majority of casualties. But it was a clumsy king. To flatten a trench line, generals relied on registration, firing a few ranging shots to see where they landed, adjusting the aim, and then unleashing a massive, days-long bombardment. This drum fire was effective at destruction, but it destroyed the element of surprise. By the time the infantry moved in, the enemy knew exactly where the blow was falling. By 1939, the German Wehrmacht believed they had solved this problem with the dive bomber. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka was their flying artillery, providing precision strikes that move with the speed of the tanks. Their ground-based guns were excellent, but their doctrine still leaned heavily on decentralized control. Battalions supported regiments, but rarely did an entire corps-level wave of fire fall on a single point simultaneously. They viewed artillery as a supporting arm, a tool to suppress the enemy while the infantry and panzers did the real work. The United States Army, arriving late to the European theater, looked at the problem through a different lens, that of the industrialist and the mathematician. While the Germans focused on the individual brilliance of their commanders, the Americans focused on the system. They inherited a tradition of mass fire from the American Civil War and combined it with the burgeoning power of 20th century communication. The U.S. Army didn't just want to support their infantry. They wanted to use the infantry to find the enemy so the artillery could finish them. At the heart of this revolution was the Fire Direction Center, or FDC. Before the 1940s, an observer in the field talked directly to a single battery of guns. If he wanted more fire, he had to coordinate with multiple commanders, a slow and agonizing process of relays and radio checks. The Americans changed the flow. They placed a brain between the observer and the guns. When a forward observer spotted a German column, he didn't call a battery. He called the FDC. This center had the authority and the technical means to command every gun within range, dozens, sometimes hundreds of barrels, and treat them as a single massive weapon. This centralized brain was powered by a level of mathematical rigor that bordered on the obsessive. In the years leading up to the invasion of Europe, the U.S. Army's Field Artillery School at Fort Sill had become a temple of ballistic computation. They understood that to achieve the devil's reign, they had to account for variables that previous generations had ignored or estimated. Every battery commander received daily metro messages, complex meteorological reports detailing air density, temperature, and wind speed at various altitudes. They knew that a shell flying to thin, cold air of a winter morning would travel differently than one fired into the humid heat of a summer afternoon. But the true genius lay in the mastery of time. The American doctrine shifted from massing guns to massing fires. In the old way of war, if a general wanted to hit a target with 3 batteries, all 3 would fire at the same moment, because the batteries were located at different distances from the target, one perhaps 2 miles away and another 5 miles away. The shells would arrive in a staggered, rolling sequence. This gave the enemy seconds or even minutes to dive into trenches or scramble for the safety of the cellar. The Americans realized that the only way to achieve total tactical overmatch was to ensure that the first round from every gun hit the target at the exact same second. This required a reverse-engineered countdown of staggering complexity. The FDC would calculate the time of flight for every individual battery. A battery located far to the rear would fire first, its shells arching high into the stratosphere. Seconds later, a closer battery would fire. Finally, the guns nearest the front would bark. To an outside observer, it sounded like a chaotic, disjointed series of thuds across the horizon. But at the target end, the result was a singular, cataclysmic arrival. By 1944, the U.S. had also perfected the industrial production of the SCR 608 radio, a frequency-modulated FM powerhouse that was far more reliable than the temperamental AM sets used by the Germans. This allowed for crystal-clear communication between the forward observers and the FDC. While German officers often struggled with wire lines cut by their own tanks or static choke radios, American observers could whisper into a handset from a hidden ridge and, within minutes, command the weight of an entire corps. The American system was no longer just a collection of cannons. It was a sprawling telephonic web of destruction that covered the European landscape. The Germans, who prided themselves on their qualitative superiority, their Tiger tanks and elite paratroopers, were about to find that no amount of bravery could withstand a mathematical certainty. They were entering a war where the most dangerous man on the battlefield wasn't the sniper or the tank ace, but the quiet man with a radio and a map, calculating the geometry of their annihilation. To the men in the mud, time on target Todd felt like a supernatural phenomenon, but it was actually a masterpiece of Newtonian physics and human coordination. The first angle of this devil's reign is the sheer mathematical precision required from the American Fire Direction Centers. For a top mission to succeed, the FDC officers had to work backward from a designated time over target. For example, exactly 10 a.m. They would consult firing tables that accounted for the specific muzzle velocity of each individual gun, the weight of the shell, and the drift caused by the Earth's rotation. If Battery A's shells took 48 seconds to reach the target and Battery B's took 32 seconds, the FDC controller would watch his stopwatch with agonizing focus. He would order Battery A to fire at 9 hours 59 minutes and 12 seconds, and Battery B to wait until 9 hours 59 minutes and 28 seconds. When those separate volleys met in the air, they converged from different trajectories to create a single, unified strike. This wasn't just shooting. It was a symphony of ballistics where the instruments were 155 millimeters long toms and 105 millimeters howitzers. The second angle is the forward observer, FO, the unsung architect of the slaughter. These men were the eyes of the ghost, often crawling hundreds of yards ahead of the front lines into no man's land or perched in precarious church steeples. The FO didn't carry a rifle as his primary weapon. He carried a map, a compass, and a radio. While German doctrine often required an officer to be present at the gun battery to lead, the American system empowered the lowest-ranking lieutenant in the field to be the most powerful man on the battlefield. When an FO whispered a set of coordinates into his SCR 610 radio, he wasn't asking for help. He was directing the hand of God. He had to be a master of sensing, observing where a lone registration shell landed and adjusting the entire weight of the Corps' fire in seconds. His courage was quiet, but his impact was total. If the FO could see you, you were already dead. The third angle is a German perspective, which is defined by unique and profound psychological horror. In traditional warfare, there is a crescendo. The whistle of a shell provides a fraction of a second to hit the dirt. But with time on target, the first thing a German soldier heard was the explosion of 100 shells simultaneously. There was no bracketing. No warning shots. German survivors often reported a sense of technological helplessness. Letters home and interrogation reports from 1944 reveal that German troops believed the Americans had developed a secret weapon or a fully automatic cannon that could fire hundreds of rounds at once. The psychological impact was devastating. It stripped away the veteran soldier's ability to rely on his instincts. If the first volley is a lethal one, there is no learning curve, only luck. This created a phenomenon the Germans called Fuhrwalls, a wall of fire. But unlike their own, this wall didn't move. It simply appeared fully formed out of a clear sky. The final angle is the life at the battery. For the American gunners, the Devil's Rain was not a mathematical abstraction, but a grueling physical labor. While the FDC did the thinking, the crews of the 105 millimeters and 155 millimeters howitzers were the engines of the system. During a top mission, the rhythm was relentless. Gunners had to set fuses, load shells, and prime charges with stopwatch precision. A delay of even 2 seconds by a single loader could ruin the synchronization of the entire corps. They worked in a haze of cordite smoke and ear-shattering concussions, often firing until the paint on the gun barrels bubbled and peeled from the heat. These men rarely saw the enemy they were killing. They lived in a world of coordinates, elevation wheels, and time to fire commands barked over the radio. Their war was one of heavy lifting and frantic speed, knowing that the safety of the infantry miles away depended entirely on their ability to beat the clock. The climax of the Devil's Rain reached its most terrifying maturity during the winter of 1944, specifically during the Battle of the Bulge. By this stage of the war, American artillery had moved beyond mere support. It had become the primary instrument of German defeat. On the morning of December 16, 1944, the German army launched its last great gamble, throwing 3 armies into thin American lines in the Ardennes. They hoped that the heavy fog and low clouds would ground the Allied air forces, stripping the Americans of their greatest advantage. But the Germans had forgotten that the king of battle does not need to see the sun to kill. As the German 5th Panzer Army and the 6th SS Panzer Army surged forward, they encountered an invisible barrier at places like Elsenborn Ridge and the narrow corridors leading to Bastogne. On December 18th, near the town of Neuville, German commanders observed a phenomenon that would haunt their after-action reports. They were preparing a massive, coordinated tank and infantry assault. According to German doctrine, they had moved their assembly areas just out of the traditional, harassing fire range of American batteries. They believed they were safe to organize, refuel, and brief their officers. They were wrong. American forward observers, hidden in the second stories of shattered stone farmhouses, had already mapped every crossroads and clearing. At the fire direction centers, the math of the kill was being finalized. The order was given, time on target, at my command. The result was a slaughter that defied military precedent. In a single second, the designated assembly area was hit by the concentrated fire of 18 different battalions. This wasn't a bombing run that lasted minutes. It was an instantaneous erasure of a physical space. German Tigers and Panthers, beasts of steel that were nearly invulnerable from the front, were flipped onto their sides or had their thin top armor crushed by 155 millimeter shells falling vertically. The infantry, caught in the open while checking their gear, simply ceased to exist. When the smoke cleared, the great German offensive in that sector hadn't just been slowed. The units assigned to it had been deleted from the order of battle before they ever saw an American soldier. The devastation at Elsenborn Ridge was not an isolated incident. It was the blueprint for the final months of the war. As the German offensive pressed toward the vital hub of Bastogne, the Devil's Rain became the city's true walls. Inside the perimeter, the 101st Airborne was surrounded and outgunned, but they were never alone. Behind them, just beyond the German ring, sat the long-range heavy hitters of the U.S. Third Army. The coordination reached a fever pitch on December 23, 1944. As the skies finally cleared and German panzers attempted a final, desperate push to break the American pocket, the FDCs orchestrated a masterwork of synchronized violence. At one point, a German commander, General Otto von Manchefeld, noted that his troops were being decimated by fire that seemed to anticipate their every move. It wasn't anticipation. It was the speed of the American communication loop. A German unit would be spotted, and within 3 minutes, a top mission would be calculated and executed. The climax of this tactic was the total suppression of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. As they attempted to maneuver in the open fields near Hemmerl, the Americans didn't just fire at the tanks. They fired at the space around the tanks to strip away the supporting infantry. The top volleys were so perfectly timed that German soldiers were found dead in their tracks, still holding their rifles, with no signs of having ever tried to dive for cover. The Devil's Rain had achieved the ultimate goal of artillery, the total physical and moral collapse of the enemy. By the time the siege of Bastogne was lifted, the German High Command was forced to face a grim reality. Their veteran NCOs and officers, the backbone of the Wehrmacht, had been slaughtered not in honorable combat, but by invisible mathematicians miles away. The traditional German tactical advantage of aggressive movement had been neutralized by the American ability to turn any square kilometer of Europe into a death-time zone at a moment's notice. The German soldier began to refer to the American artillery not as a weapon, but as the butcher's butcher. The aftermath of the Devil's Rain was written in the silence of the European countryside. When the smoke finally drifted away from the battlefields of the Ardennes and the Rhineland, the physical evidence of American artillery dominance was staggering. Intelligence officers conducting damage assessments found that in areas targeted by time-on-target missions, the concentration of craters was so dense that the ground resembled the surface of the moon. Unlike the scattered overs and unders of traditional barrages, Todt strikes created a literal kill box where the probability of survival for anyone caught in the open was effectively zero. Statistical reports from the U.S. Army's Ordnance Department revealed a chilling efficiency. In several engagements during the winter of 1944, it was estimated that 60% to 70% of German casualties were caused by artillery fragments. More tellingly, the ratio of shells fired to confirmed kills dropped significantly. The Americans weren't just firing more. They were making every shell count by ensuring the first one was the most lethal. German logistics were also paralyzed. The top missions didn't just target frontline troops, but also hit vital bridges and crossroads miles behind the lines at the exact moment supply convoys were scheduled to pass, a feat made possible by the intersection of high-level intelligence and ballistic timing. For the German military, the aftermath was a crisis of doctrine. The Wehrmacht had always relied on the counterattack, the Gegenstoss, as their primary defensive tool. As soon as an American unit took a hill, the Germans would gather their reserves and strike back before the Americans could dig in. Todt destroyed this tactic. Every time German reserves gathered in a forest or behind a ridge to prepare their counterstroke, the Devil's Rain fell. By early 1945, German commanders reported that their men were becoming artillery shy, refusing to congregate in groups larger than a squad for fear of triggering a massed American response. The very cohesion of the German army was dissolving under the weight of American math. The physical destruction was only half of the story. The true aftermath was found in the psychological ruins of the German prisoner of war camps. Allied interrogators began to notice a recurring theme in the testimonies of captured Lancer. These were not the broken, inexperienced boys of the late war drafts, but seasoned veterans who survived the horrors of the Eastern Front. Yet, they spoke of the American artillery with a unique, trembling reverence. One captured German major famously remarked, "I can withstand 1,000 Russians, but I cannot withstand this automatic rain from the sky." The terror was fueled by the sudden introduction of proximity fuse, or the VT fuse. While Todt ensured all shells arrived at once, the VT fuse ensured they didn't bury themselves in the mud before exploding. Using a tiny radar set inside the nose of the shell, these projectiles would detonate exactly 30 to 50 feet above the ground. This showered the German foxholes with downward-traveling shrapnel, rendering the traditional digging and method of survival completely useless. Combined with Todt, the VT fuse meant that the first thing a soldier felt was a blast from above, with no dirt walls to protect him. This era marked the birth of a new level of military psychiatry. The U.S. Army Medical Corps observed that German prisoners often suffer from a specific type of concussive shock, a state of near catatonia caused by the sheer atmospheric overpressure of hundreds of shells exploding simultaneously. The Americans had successfully industrialized trauma. By the spring of 1945, the Devil's Rain had effectively broken the back of the German defensive spirit. The realization had set in across all ranks. The war was no longer a contest of wills, but a mechanical process of liquidation. The American artillery had turned the European theater into a giant, open-air factory of attrition, where the only output was a total neutralization of the enemy. The story of the Devil's Rain is more than a chronicle of ballistic superiority. It is a reflection on a moment warfare shifted from the romanticized clash of warriors to the cold, undeniable precision of the machine. In the woods of the Ardennes and the valleys of the Rhineland, the U.S. Army Field Artillery didn't just win battles. They redefined the relationship between time, space, and human survival. By treating the battlefield as a mathematical grid and the clock as a weapon, they stripped away the fog of war and replaced it with a terrifying, calculated clarity. This era of American artillery marked the true birth of modern fire support. The principles established by the Fire Direction Centers in 1944, centralized control, rapid communication, and synchronized delivery, remain the bedrock of NATO doctrine today. From the GPS-guided munitions of the 21st century to the advanced digital fire control systems used by modern howitzers, the DNA of time on target is present in every precision strike. It was the moment the king of battle put on a suit of armor forged in industry and mathematics, becoming an entity that could not be bargained with or outbraved. Ultimately, the Devil's Reign serves as a somber reminder of the cost of technological overmatch. To the German soldiers who endured it, the tactic was a physics-defying nightmare. To the Americans who orchestrated it, it was a way to save the lives of their own infantry by ensuring that no enemy could stand long enough to pull a trigger. It was a brutal, efficient philosophy that steel is cheaper than blood, and that in the face of total war, the most merciful way to end a conflict is to make the opposition's position utterly untenable. The echoes of those synchronized volleys still ring through history, a testament to the time when the sky itself became a tool of the mathematician and the rain turned to fire.